As members and friends of UUC, many of us have been learning about structural racism in our society. Over the past years, many of us have been reading books, we wrote articles, we attended workshops on racism in the US. Some of you even traveled to Montgomery to visit the Lynching Museum and the church where Martin Luther King was the pastor. And now, today, as a congregation, we take the next step on this complicated journey of understanding and spiritual development. During this year, we will have a chance to discover the meaning of the eighth principle, ask questions, and get answers. Finally, at our annual meeting in May, we will get to vote on whether UUC will adopt the eighth principle. I know many of you have questions, and I hope today's presentation will begin to answer some of them. However, this is an ongoing learning experience for all of us. The UUC Eighth Principle Task Force, Trudy Diamond, Bill Foley, Irina Ryan, and I will be presenting many opportunities over the next 7 months to learn more about what the eighth principle is, and why we're considering its adoption. So today, after I finish talking, Meredith will explain the process for asking questions using the chat. Then Irina and our guest speaker, Bruce Pollock Johnson, will have a conversation about the eighth principle. After that, you will have a chance to have your questions answered. And then Trudy will close the session and give us the next steps for UUC. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the UUC website. So let's begin. Meredith, take it away.
Okay, so you can post your questions in the chat throughout the conversation that Bruce and Irina are having. Just as they come up, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'd like to have them in the chat if at all possible so that we can have them captured. But I understand that you might be on an iPad and it might be too cumbersome to type something into the chat. And if that's the case, I'm also going to be watching the gallery so that it's watching, where I can see everybody. And you can either raise your hand or use the reaction button to raise your hand when we get to that point. So I'm going to take the questions from the chat first, and then if I get to a point where we're out of questions in the chat, I'll ask, does anybody have a question? And then you can raise your hand at that point. Hopefully that is clear. On to Irina.
Hello, I'm Irina Ryan, and I'm going to be talking to Bruce today. And in case you're wondering, I believe it was in the e-octogram, but I'm going to tell you why we have Bruce here is because he was a co-author of the eighth principle along with Paula Cole-Jones. Let me give you a little background on him. Actually, he started in social justice with his program at Brandeis. He was studying sociology and education. He ended up getting a PhD in operations research from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been involved in social justice and math for years. He was a professor at Oberlin, and he is currently a tenured professor in the Department of Mathematics and Mathematical Sciences at Villanova University. He's been involved in their Peace and Justice program and Peace and Justice Education program, and he created and he teaches 2 courses called Math and Fairness, which he teaches to incoming students, and Math and Social Justice, which is for more advanced students. He's on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committees of his department and at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. As I said, he's a co-author of the principle. He's also the moderator and the chair of the Justice Council at his congregation, UU Mount Airy, which was the first congregation to adopt the eighth principle. He also lends his singing voice at protests and rallies at Philadelphia and at the weekly Black Lives Matter vigils at the Mount Airy congregation. He's been doing that since 2014. Welcome, Bruce. And by the way, Bruce is Zooming to us. Thank you, you're welcome. He's Zooming to us from Italy. I didn't get exactly in Italy where you're at, Bruce.
I'm in Genoa, which is in the northwest part of the country.
Okay, so we're lucky. We've got him all the way from Italy today. And so I'm going to start off really simply. What exactly is the eighth principle?
So the eighth principle came out of an awareness. Paula Cole-Jones, who you mentioned as the co-author, had been a consultant, had been doing racial and social justice work in the UUA for about 20 years. And in somewhere around 2013, she noticed a pattern in congregations that she was visiting, and she put them in two different categories. One she called a seven principles congregation, and the others were a beloved community conversation. And the idea, basically the idea was that there were congregations and UUs who understood the seven principles, felt totally that they were living by the seven principles, but really did not have any significant awareness of systemic racism and other kinds of oppressions. And so she, in the process of thinking about that, said, well, maybe what we need is another principle, since the principles are what most UUs are actually aware of from our foundational documents. And we were together when she said that, and I'm the kind of person that if somebody says something like that, I'm not going to fall asleep until I've actually done something about it. So I, that night, wrote up a draft of the eighth principle. We talked about it and adjusted it. We also had a group that had done a Jubilee anti-racism training that had decided to continue monthly meetings after the original Jubilee, and they helped us to think it through and refine the wording. And the basic idea, maybe this would be a good time, we can just put up, Jeremy, if it's possible to put up the eighth principle again, we could remind those folks who maybe weren't here when we showed it earlier. So it says, I'll just say, we covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So the important pieces there are institutions or systems, the idea that it's by our actions, not just talking about things, the idea of the spiritual background being that we're trying to move towards spiritual wholeness, that racism and other oppressions separate us from ourselves and us from other people in a way that is damaging to our souls. And I think most of you by now have heard many times the idea of beloved community espoused by Martin Luther King and others before him as kind of a vision of where we're trying to go as a community, both as UUs and ideally as a world. So the idea was that it probably would only be an additional principle that would make it possible for people to raise that awareness of systemic racism and other oppressions to a level where we would actually be doing something about it and making a difference in that situation. There's many people that have said, you know, the first principle really implies the eighth principle in a lot of ways, and I would agree with that. But we're not at the point in our consciousness as a denomination or an association that we're there yet. And one way that I think about it is we could pass the eighth principle and maybe 30 years down the line, it's so obvious in everybody's consciousness that we don't need it anymore. And we could just go back to the earlier principles because we'd have that level of awareness.
Now, my next question was, why is now a good time to add the seven principles? But I think you've already answered a little bit, but would you expound on that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the main reasons, very recently, as you know, we've in the UUA, which was started in the early 60s, there's really only been two major crises that have come up, and both had to do with racial justice. One was back in the late 70s, late 60s and early 70s, when the General Assembly voted to allocate a huge sum of money, $250 $50,000 to a group of people of color that were going to decide on how it would be used in community projects. But the association had some financial troubles and had to renege on that promise. And a lot of people of color who had joined UUism after the civil rights movement were very disappointed and ended up leaving. So that was one major crisis. The one that I'm sure everybody is aware of is just 4 years ago in 2017, our president resigned of the UUA, basically related to systemic racism in our hiring and the fact that there were aspects of the way we were doing things that were, injecting systemic racism into the process. So it really, and that was the reason that we had the co-presidents starting in 2017 and the creation of the Commission on Institutional Change that wrote the Widening the Circle of Concern report was to try to understand and deal with what had happened and the crisis that it had created. The Widening the Circle is really a blueprint of what are some of the ways that systemic racism has found its way into who we are and what we can do about it. And the eighth principle is really the chance to make a commitment, because we did some great work in the 90s, raised a lot of consciousness, did a lot of good work, but then it kind of petered out in the early 2000s. A much milder version of multiculturalism ended up kind of taking the place of the more hard systemic issues that are covered in the Jubilee workshops. They were less and less supported. And as a result, that kind of led to what happened in 2017. So in our opinion, what's needed is a commitment, not just saying the good things and then moving on to the next issue du jour, but making that commitment and sticking with it. And that's what it's all about as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, and I have heard that some people say, well, why are we adding a new principle? Why not just count the other 7 principles, especially the first one? Why not add new wording? But I think you've already answered that. But could you give us some of the UU grassroots history on social justice regarding, racism and these other oppressions? Could you give us some background on that, please?
Sure. I'll give some of the highlights at least. As far as abolitionism and working against slavery, there were certainly Unitarians and Universalists who worked for abolition, but it was not everybody. And even people who worked for abolition didn't even necessarily believe that Black people were equal to white people. They thought slavery was wrong, but they didn't necessarily, including Thomas Jefferson. And so there's been that kind of systemic racism in a significant part of who we've been, both Unitarians and Universalists. There was a movement called eugenics in the early 1900s that involved a lot of scientists and respected people in universities, including a lot of Unitarians especially, that led to essentially what happened in Germany in the Nazis and the Holocaust, trying to purify the race from a scientific point of view, believing that there were differences between people, which has since been disproven. But we certainly have, and there were people of color who wanted to be ministers, but were not able to take a church. Sometimes some were able to go through seminary, but were not able to take churches. So there's been significant racism in our system for a long time. The part that we all like to remember or know about was in the 60s when wonderful work was done in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King had an affinity for Unitarianism, but realized that he probably couldn't be a leader of people of color as if the religion that he had was something like that was so white. But he definitely had an affinity for, and when he asked help. We did a great job of building relationships with people of color in the civil rights movement. And when they needed help in Selma, UUs got called and answered that call. And we should be very proud of all the work that was done to bring about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act from all that activism. So that, I guess, in a nutshell, is the main parts of our history. We have things to be proud of and also things that we need to be aware of and making up for in some ways.
Well, thank you. And since you were your congregation was the first one to adopt the eighth principle, can you give us a little bit of the history of what that was like? What did your congregation go through?
Sure. We actually wrote the eighth principle in 2013, but our congregation didn't adopt it until 2017. But what we did do immediately in 2013, and the main issue at that time was basically what you might call the hierarchy of oppression. People were saying, well, why focus on racism as opposed to maybe sexism and patriarchy or economic class, which was one of the major reasons that the social construct of race was created in the first place. So we were having that conversation in our congregation, but we had been very active in the 60s in the civil rights movement, and nobody had a problem with the idea of the eighth principle. And basically what we decided at that point was to incorporate it into our congregational covenant. So the phrases of the eighth principle ended up being part of our covenant. So in some ways, we sort of adopted it, but in a different form, not as a principle. Then in 2017, after the crisis in the UUA, after doing a lot of work, we've been doing a Black Lives Matter vigil since 2014, since Ferguson happened. And in the process, people have been educating themselves and becoming much more aware. And so by that time, it was a no-brainer that this needs to be done.
Okay, yeah, I can understand that. But could you give us some of the challenges that other UU congregations, because you kind of started the process way earlier than I think a lot of us are. So what are they facing in digging deeper into the systemic racism in their own backyard and in society as well?
I guess one of some of it is what I mentioned before, the idea of other kinds of oppressions and why aren't they mentioned in the eighth principle. Some of them have to do with wording, because we as UUs in general tend to be highly educated, very focused on wording and words. And so there's a natural tendency to try to edit the eighth principle. And so one thing that's come up in some congregations, and the feeling that Paula and I have had from the beginning is what we wrote is not perfect. It's not the most poetic way of expressing it, perhaps, but it's important to have all those atomic pieces of the eighth principle. They're all important. How it's worded in the long run is not important, but at this point, when we're trying to build momentum, it's important to get as many congregations saying the same thing. So there's a very clear message to the Article 2 Commission that's coming up with a proposal for the new principles and purposes to have a clear message of what is wanted. If we have over 120 congregations that have adopted the eighth principle, but if we had 120 different versions of it, it's not going to be as powerful as if they're all saying exactly the same thing. These need to be part of it. And we have no idea what it's going to look like. They may totally rewrite the principles, and maybe there's going to be 4, maybe there'll be 15, who knows where it's going to end up. But in some ways, the wording of the eighth principle is in part of the charge of the Article 2 Commission. And I think it's pretty clear that something will be there, but the more that we can build that momentum, and as far as I'm concerned, frankly, my goal would be to have every congregation adopt the eighth principle for themselves before it gets voted on at General Assembly. Because once it's voted on in General Assembly, people say, oh, we've taken care of that. It's problem solved. But they won't have done the hard work. And the main reason that I wanted the eighth principle to be promoted is as an excuse, as a reason for people to look deeply at systemic racism, think about it, talk about it, examine their own selves and their congregations and their lives, and see what they might be able to do to change that. And so I'm very happy with the way things, at the beginning, I had no idea where it would go, but there's a lot of people talking and thinking about it. And so as far as I'm concerned, it satisfied what I wanted from the eighth principle, but it could also be a very powerful, major influence on our movement and where we're going in the future.
Well, that makes sense because UUs are not into top-down organization. They want to be more from the bottom up. So that makes a lot of sense to have each congregation, you know, develop their own programs, develop their own attitude. But as you said, keeping the wording the same so that we have that unity with each other. But let me ask you, how does doing the work around the eighth principle make us more truly welcome to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and of course, lesbian, gay, trans, questioning, all the people in that, and any other group that's faced oppression? How does that help out?
I can give you a perfect example from my congregation. And just so that you know, my congregation used to be called the UU Church of the Restoration. So if you ever hear Restoration, that's the same congregation as UUs of Mount Airy, which we just changed our name to. Part of the reason we changed the name was because the word church was not inclusive of a number of people, whether it's earth-based spirituality or people of Jewish origin, Buddhists, and others. And so that was something that we wanted to do to be more inclusive. But what I was going to say was we were very active in the 1960s. We actually helped to create a neighborhood organization to stop blockbusting by realtors who were trying to scare white families to move to the suburbs in the 60s to make money for themselves because they would turn more real estate that way. And when people in our neighborhood saw that we were doing that work, they joined our church. And so it's not just a question of, you know, saying the words, but doing the work itself, seeing where the need is, being involved in it, being supportive of people who are affected by oppressions and giving that support like happened in Selma. So I think that's huge. Another factor is, you know, examining the music, the readings. If your music is only classical, if your readings are only dead white men, then that's not necessarily going to feel inclusive to people from other groups. And you know, you can't make a total change, but why, if you were coming to a church and were interested in it, you would want to hear something that feels like you, that connects to you in some way. And so, you know, that's one of the kinds of things that adopting the eighth principle and then thinking about, well, what is our system like? You know, UUism and the United States, for that matter, were created in the Kool-Aid of racism. That it was baked into our Constitution. It, even before the US was created, it was part of the culture very early on, from the 1600s on. And so naturally, we just do what comes to us, what we're familiar with, but that's not necessarily going to get where we want to go with a vision of beloved community that's more inclusive of other people.
Thank you. I do have one last question, which is how can we learn more? But I'm thinking right now that there may be something that you want to talk about in this adoption of the eighth principle that I haven't covered. Is there something that you'd like to add here that maybe we haven't touched upon yet before we get to the
Sure. I mean, there's a couple things that I'd like to say. One of them is with those two incidents I mentioned in the UUA's history that were both related to race. I like to think of it as we've had two strikes against us there's a pitch coming towards us right now, and we have a chance to hit it out of the park, or we could swing and miss. And this is really our challenge right now. And I don't know that we're going to get more than 3 strikes, as the legislation, the sad racist legislation said. So this is really, if we believe that we're a movement that should appeal to all people, and it does. If you talk to people of color and from other groups, they love the spiritual dimensions and the theology of what we're all about. But if we don't live up to that potential, they're going to come because it's very attractive. But if our culture in our individual congregations and as a group don't feel inclusive to them, then they're not going to stick around. So if we want to fulfill our potential as a movement, which I think is incredible, then this is what we need to be working on. The other thing I think about, which is kind of a different category, but has to do with just kind of the oblivious side of things that I mentioned before. And it's just to picture a scenario. If you went into a dinner situation, sitting around tables with other people, and everybody started with the same dinner, but then someone walked in, and from some of the, let's say, the people of color at the table, you know, if there were multiple desserts, and they took some of the desserts from the people of color and gave them to some of the white folks at the table, we would be appalled, and we would say something and intervene. But the problem is that in our situation where we are now, those exchanges have already happened. We come to the dinner, we sit down, we might not even notice what other people have gotten or haven't gotten, and we think everything's normal, everything's fine. We don't have any awareness of it. So what we need to do is to look, and the system is totally created to not have us examine it, to not question things, to make it the easiest thing to just be oblivious and go on with our lives, especially for those of us who are white, because we get a lot of the benefits from that. But we also pay the spiritual price of not being whole, of being connected to a system and benefiting from a system that is really hurting lots of people.
Thank you for that. Yes, I've heard that racism doesn't hurt just people of color. It hurts white people too, and it has historically. So is there anything else that you'd like to say, or is that it? Because my last question is, how can people learn more about the 8th principle?
Probably the best thing to do, just to add to the grassroots nature of what we're doing, we created a 8th principle learning community, which has now evolved into a monthly Zoom gathering. Basically, people who either have already adopted the 8th principle and want to know what the next steps are, or people who are just starting to think about it. We have presentations from people who have been involved with the 8th principle, sharing what they've done. Ministers have come to talk about the 8th principle from their perspective. We have people of color saying how much it meant to them when their congregation passed the 8th principle and how it felt like a loving hug to them, and others whose congregations have not considered it, and they've grown more distant as a result, not getting that same kind of positive feedback. So did that answer? I'm thinking I might have missed the.
But no, yes, no, that is one way. And I assume that you mentioned earlier about widening the circle. Would that be one?
Right. Yeah, no. So the learning community meets once a month at this point. There usually are 200 or 300 people involved, but we normally have an open question and answer period. So especially for people who are starting on the process, can raise any questions or issues that they might be having, and people share, and it's much more powerful because we have hundreds of people who are working and can help each other, rather than being a top-down kind of thing. Probably the biggest thing would be a Jubilee 3, workshop. The Jubilee workshops have been totally redesigned, and they're available currently via Zoom, but there will be in-person, I think there have been some in-person versions recently as well. So that would be, that is really an intensive workshop that exposes the idea of systemic racism and what the implications of that are. It goes from a Friday evening through Sunday late afternoon, so it's very intensive. But that's the biggest changes we've seen in people are having got when they've gone through that training. And if several people from a congregation can do it together, that's even more powerful, because then you have a group to debrief with and to support each other. So that's been really good. I see the question.
We're about ready to go to questions now. Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. Appreciate it. Off to you, Meredith.
So much, Bruce and Arena. That dialogue was just great. And Bruce, I really appreciate the honesty and compassion with which you dealt with our history and all the topics that you discussed. And I hear a lot of pragmatism as well. So I just really appreciate everything you've had to share. Margie asks, how can we identify examples of systemic racism in our own congregation? Once we identify those examples and work to change them, how do we deal with potential pushback from people who don't agree those examples are racist?
That's a very good question. I think probably maybe one of the best ways to focus the effort is to think of it from a point of view of inclusion, and to, I think in the 90s, one of the issues was kind of a little too much people calling each other out without connecting, without being in relation and being able to develop people's understanding to get to another stage. So I think connecting it to to find an example, and then to think of an example of how would that be exclusive to someone from a certain category, like the music that I was talking about, or there's many other examples. A number of congregations are talking about whether Robert's Rules of Order are, they're clearly very European and very much connected to white culture, white supremacy culture. And so, for instance, our congregation has been experimenting with other forms of decision-making that are more inclusive. One of them is called modified consensus. Another is called consent, which is part of a system called sociocracy that the UUA has been doing more workshops really about. So I think less kind of pointing fingers and labeling, and more explanation of how a certain thing might have a certain effect on a group that, if we've adopted the 8th principle and we agree that we want to be inclusive and trying to dismantle those kinds of things. And I guess, if you can find an example of someone who personally has felt that kind of exclusion, maybe would be the best way to respond.
That makes sense. Thanks. And how do we get into that 8th principle learning community? Trudy asks.
So I put the email of Paula Cole-Jones in the chat. All you need to do is write your name, your congregation, and your email in an email to her. It's just pcjones@gmail.com. And she should send you an email once you've been added to the list, and you can, that you'll get the link then, and then you can join. I often tell people, I can put my email here also, which is the one on the 8th Principle website if you lose track of it or forget it. But if it's 2 days before the next learning community meeting, which the next one is going to be October 20th, and you haven't gotten the link after asking for it, you can email me and I'll just forward you a copy of it, and hopefully we'll have another month to sort it out and make sure you're on the proper list. So I'm going to add my email there.
Thank you.
Again, Paula is the one who keeps track of the email list, so write to her. But if you, if you don't get it by October 18th, try sending me an email and I can make sure you get one. You can help each other also. If one of you got it and someone else didn't, it's fine to share it, but we do ask that if you like it and you want to keep on the list, to let Paula know so that your name gets counted and we have a better idea of how many people are actually involved in the community, rather than some being kind of shadow or phantom participants that we don't have an awareness of.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Bill Foley asks, how does a congregation that is overwhelmingly white find ways to understand the many problems we don't see?
That's a great question. I think having readings and music and speakers, whether it's within the service or outside, is a great way to center voices of marginalized people. And that's a great start. Certainly something like the Jubilee or a book discussion group that focuses on a topic that would help to raise people's awareness of microaggressions or other kinds of issues that are not part of mainstream white society, that those would be ways to give people a hand to realize some of those things that are out there that many of us have been oblivious about for a long time. I think one thing that some people have said, and I think it's very appropriate, because if you're in a community that does not have a lot of people of color nearby, there may not be a lot that you could do to diversify your congregation, but the goal would be to be a place that if a person of color came, they would feel included and want to stay. And it doesn't mean that because of your circumstances that that's necessarily going to happen, but to have raised your consciousness and culture to a level where someone would feel welcome, I think, is the goal. Because in some ways, the problem is white people like me, that we're the ones who created this system, we're the ones who can dismantle it. In some ways, it's appropriate for us to, in a group that's largely white, to be saying, okay, well, what did we do and then what can we do to fix it? How can we remove those things that our ancestors did along the way that we have the power to do something about now?
Yeah, thank you for all those examples. There's so much learning and work to do for sure. Susan Allen says, I have had difficulty finding information about when the Jubilee training will be held for a time zone closer to ours. In other words, not Pacific or Hawaii. And is the current training Jubilee 3? And I remember you saying it is Jubilee 3 that's being done now. Do you have any other advice about the rest of that?
Well, I left the email for Paula. She, I think, coordinates all of the Jubilees. And I know that All Souls in Washington, D.C. Almost always has at least one a year, if not two a year, which would be in the Eastern time zone. I'm not sure between in-person and Zoom, but I imagine that almost all of them would have Zoom accessibility, at least for a while, before we get ourselves out of what we're in right now.
Okay, very good.
Because I think there's sort of a website, but it's not very well maintained for Jubilee 3. So I think Paul is really the best person to get more information about the current. There is also an Eighth Principle Facebook closed group that you need to, again, you can contact Paula to see if you can become part of that. They made the system a little more complicated for people to be able to do that. So I haven't been dealing with it, so I don't know all the complications, but anyway, that's another place that if there's a new Jubilee coming, that it would probably be listed there, because that's definitely a priority for a lot of eighth principle congregations that are thinking about it.
Got it. Okay, so a few different options, but it sounds like Paula Cole-Jones, emailing her at the email address that was put into the chat earlier is the most reliable way of finding out more.
Right.
Great. Okay. Kathy Crone asks, this is a little bit longer. While as an adult, I have learned so very much that I didn't realize I needed to know through beloved conversations, etc. But it occurs to me that our youth and children's education efforts are crucial to continuing to build racial equity and justice. And she says in parentheses, can you tell we live in a state that is close to banning critical race theory? Question, 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 exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. So I see this principle as being a wonderful window into building our future. If we make our RE instruction eighth principle active, I am sure it will bring in families that will be drawn to this. Any thoughts?
That's a great observation. There's someone in New York State that has created kind of a beta version of a eighth principle curriculum at several different levels, I believe. Probably, again, checking in with Paula would be a good way to get direct information about that. But a couple comments. One is that in some ways, our kids are the ones who need it the least, but I think the recruitment idea is significant, that if you are offering that for the RE program, young adults or parents who are looking for a spiritual home will see that and be attracted. And somebody at one of our eighth principle calls said, basically, if you want to attract anybody under 40, adopt the eighth principle. As a just kind of matter of fact, and especially if there are several different congregations in a certain area and someone's looking and one of them has adopted and the others haven't, it's going to be an obvious choice for a lot of younger folk.
That makes a lot of sense. And Margie Manning basically asked that question, is children's version of the eighth, is there children's version of the eighth principle similar to how there is a children's version of the seven principles, so in simplified language?
There has been, I don't know if I have it on the tip of my tongue, but I've seen a couple versions, basically talking about people from different groups or something that is more generic. Yeah, sorry, I don't have it, but I could probably find it and send it to one of the people on the committee if you wanted to circulate that. There've been a couple good ones. In addition, I didn't mention there's a escape room, the virtual escape room, which I didn't understand before was where they actually started. Then they became in person, and now probably more virtual again. But there was one created for awareness of the eighth principle targeted at high school age folks. So
will you tell everybody what an escape room is real quick?
Pardon? Oh, yeah, escape room is in a physical place. It would be you're put into a room, there's puzzles and clues. It's kind of like what do you call it, at a birthday party? Anyway, following clues to try to escape the room. So the idea is you're trying to eventually be able to get the key to unlock the door to get out of the room. And so in this case, the keys are more like PIN numbers and codes that are the analogy to keys and things in real life. And the things that you need to do are related to the eighth principle to find your way out, to get to the goal. It's something a lot of young people have enjoyed and seem to like.
Very good. Yeah, I've heard a number of people talk about it being a lot of fun. So we have a few more questions. I'm going to keep reading. Some of them might be getting more into the learning that we all have to do. So less on the eighth principle specifically and more on the learning that there is to do. So I'm going to let you discriminate as you see fit about, just tossing it back to us as needed,
Sure.
Okay. So Harriet asks, many times when a person of color comes to our Sunday service, we overwhelm them at coffee hour. How can we welcome them without scaring them away?
That is a great question. It's probably good to encourage people who've had more experience with racial justice to be interacting with folks who might be more aware of microaggressions that other people might not have thought about, the kind of thing of automatically asking where you're from, which can be kind of a marker for various things that might make people feel uncomfortable, or saying, to a person of color, you're so articulate is going to be a major insult, and or where are you from for somebody who doesn't look or where someone can't identify, and then even if they say Akron, Ohio, and they say, no, where are you really from, because they look Asian or whatever. Anyway, obviously you want to try to avoid that kind of thing, and maybe it's even worth as a congregation having a conversation about just kind of protocols and how you would like to be with newcomers so that that doesn't happen. By the way, one of the eighth principle does say racism, but it says other oppressions, and I think one of the most important oppressions right now, other than racism, is transgender related issues. And there's a wonderful workshop called the Trans Inclusion Workshop by the Transforming Hearts Collective that has a whole section about beloved community. It overlaps beautifully with the eighth principle, and it goes much beyond trans issues. It includes them, but it gives kind of a framework for inclusion, radical hospitality, a lot of people call it, that would be very relevant for race as well as for LGBTQ plus kinds of issues. And it's, you can do it. Our church did it. I'm trying to think of whether it was pre-COVID or post-COVID, but we watched, there's videos that are the individual sessions. So it's online, but we watched them together. I think it was after the lockdown. So we watched them together in a Zoom space and then had conversation about it afterwards. And we loved it. Then we did a service related to trans issues that the participants put together. And that was wonderful. So I think that would be a good place to consider as a starting point.
Great, thank you. Bill Northworthy asks, what congregations have done a good job of addressing racism in the last few years? What changes have they made in their cultures?
That's a good question. And I would say, for instance, Honolulu, who were the second congregation to adopt the eighth principle, have done some amazing work with grassroots organizations in their where they are in Honolulu. That's been a wonderful model. We haven't mentioned yet, there's a program a lot of congregations have adopted called ADORE, which stands for A Dialogue on race, and ethnicity, which is just kind of a monthly conversation about whatever's in the news that might relate to race. And that's another program that Paula has helped people create. So she would be a good resource for that. So did I answer that fully, or is there, remind me of the question again to make sure?
The question was about which congregations have done a good job at this. And you mentioned
Right.
Honolulu. I'm imagining this is for role modeling purposes. You know, it's always easy to
Right.
easier to look to somebody who's done
Certainly,
it well.
All Souls in DC has been on the forefront for a long time. And I think Restoration, or UU's in Mount Airy, where I am, we're a smaller congregation, and that makes some things possible and other things more challenging to get critical mass for things. We're just entering into a relationship with NCOBRA, which stands for National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, one of the oldest, and the group behind the legislation, national legislation, House Bill 40 and Senate Bill 40, which is only asking for, you know, a study of how reparations might be dealt with, but they also get involved, and NCOBRA gets involved with many other issues. Some of you who've been to GA might have been, there were a couple of presentations this past year and the year before by members of NCOBRA that includes, we're also going to be working with them on, you know, what we might be able to do as a congregation to research our own past and think about ways that we might be able to do things to counteract things that maybe were not ideal in our past. A lot of places have been studying the Widening the Circle of Concern report and changing you know, bylaws and policies and procedures to be more in line with the 8th principle.
Lots of great examples there. Thank you.
Sure.
Trudy asks, isn't dismantling the systems an accountable goal far beyond being welcoming of people of color visiting our congregation? What activist groups should we join and become allies with? Groups currently working on the political and sociological aspects of dismantling those systemic elements of US government and society?
Excellent question. There's Allies for Racial Equity within the UUA who work with DRUM, the Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries, which is ARE is connected with for that accountability. SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice, has chapters in lots of places that it has done a lot of excellent work. I know in Philadelphia, there's an interfaith coalition that used to be just the city. Now it's expanded to the whole state that is based, and I think, is it Faith in Action, I think is now the term. There was another umbrella organization before, but it now goes by Faith in Action, which is basically grounded in the experience of people who are feeling the pain in society the most and working from that, dialoguing with them to see what needs to be done wherever you are. I don't know, does Florida have a legislative action network, like if there is one, you could click on, if there is one, you could join it, because it's a way for UUs to, like in Pennsylvania, which has, you know, liberal pockets and very conservative pockets. It's very helpful to have people from all over the state who can write to their legislators when, you know, it's not clear what the balance in the legislature is going to be, and so that's certainly another possibility.
Yeah, I saw as you were asking that question, you know, it's hard for us to see since we're spotlighted, but there were plenty of people nodding, yes, that legislative action group does exist. I'm relatively new to Florida. Arena Ryan says the wording in the 8th principle that seems most problematic is, quote, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions, end quote. Would you address the issue of accountability?
Sure. I mean, in some ways, the 8th principle itself is accountability because we're making a commitment to be working on this for the ongoing future. I think the idea of accountability is not to just do what you think is what's needed, because that's a very white thing to do, to see a situation, come up with a solution, and try to enact that solution, whether the people who are affected think that's a good idea or not. And so the accountability helps to make sure that doesn't happen as much as possible, to be working with a group that has people of color or whatever group it is that you're concerned about, trans folks or whatever, to be able to let you know and even follow their lead, say that we're here to be your allies or accomplices or support, and then know how we can leverage privilege that we may have, whether it's as white or straight or tall or whatever, to work against those kinds of oppressions in the way that's going to be most appreciated by the people who need it.
Great, thank you. Kathy Crone asks, can you tell us the difference between the Jubilee experience and Beloved Conversations?
I think Beloved Conversations is a great way to start to go deeper in talking about race and exploring your own race. So for that, it's kind of a covenant group or small group ministry kind of approach that is very effective. The Jubilee 3 is more of a conceptual experience to kind of wrap your brain around how the system works, tends to work, and how we participate as cogs in those wheels in that machine. And therefore, I think it's in some ways much more powerful in being more aware of what needs to be done and maybe how to start working on that.
So it sounds to me like the Jubilee experience is a little more, it's deeper potentially, or more impactful. Is there, would you say that there are things that one should do kind of as prerequisites to be prepared for such an experience?
Not necessarily, but I mean, certainly there's lots of great books out there. Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is pretty small, but very powerful. There's lots of other good books out there that can help to get you thinking. But I don't think there's really one of the advantages of the Jubilee 3 or the Jubilees is that they take you wherever you are and you move a little further forward. I've gone to a number of them and I get things out of them each time because, you know, you need to be at a certain level to see the next hill over the horizon that needs to be scaled. Yeah, I mean, it certainly couldn't hurt to do advanced homework, but I don't think it's necessary. It will get you to the next hill a little sooner.
Okay, that's it's nice to hear that. Okay, we just keep moving forward as long as we're moving in the right direction. That's the main thing. A number of people have put some additional information in the chat, but I don't see any more questions. Is there anybody who wasn't able to put a question in the chat who wants to raise your hand to ask a question?
I also wanted to check with Arena to see if I fully answered your question, because I think I only got to parts of it. So if there's other pieces that I didn't address.
Well, it's funny. I put the question in the chat because when I was first accumulating these, I had written that part about the accountability, and somehow when I printed it out today, it wasn't there. So wait a minute, I got to put that in there, because that, for many of us, we have heard this about other congregations, that the big problem is saying, wait a minute, we're saying accountable, and we don't have that in the other 7 principles. We don't say you have to be accountable for treating everyone with dignity and respect. We don't say that about all the other things, accountable for Earth's actions. But you and Paula wrote that in this one, and then people are like, well, you know, when you have to commit to something, it's like, we have to actually be counted here. How do we look at that? And that has been a block for people thinking about
Well, there's really 2 aspects of accountability. One of them is just holding ourselves accountable, saying we've made this commitment. We need to keep looking, you know, with an 8th principle lens, we say, at what we're doing. And as things evolve, we might get new insights about it. So that's one type of accountability. And the other kind is the one that I was mentioning earlier. And they're both important. And you know, if it makes sense to focus on the holding ourselves accountable first, and then moving to the deeper level of getting that accountable relationship with other communities, especially if that's not easy to do immediately, then, you know, however it's going to be possible to get there is the best way.
Yes, and I also like what you said to answer to another question about how do we get people involved, and how do we, you know, maybe shake things up. And you said, well, you know, it really doesn't work to come in and say, you're not doing this, you're not doing this, you're not doing this. Because let's face it, a lot of white people already have guilt about racism. And one of the things that we've noticed is there've been very few men in our beloved conversations when we had, I think, 2 or 3 on our campus. And I surmise that might be because of the whole, you know, straight white male guilt. You know, we're the ones that set up the system 400 years ago, and now we're getting blamed for everything, and we weren't actually even there. So I suspect that even men that are very much emotionally and intellectually behind the 8th principle, they don't want to go in and feel like they're going to get beat up. I've heard that from some men of my acquaintance, and I think you're right. People come in and say, well, you're just not getting this done. I mean, that's just going to turn everybody off. You gotta come in and say, this is what we've been told needs to be done.
And I would say guilt is awareness plus lack of action. And one way to feel guilt is by more awareness. And when that happens at first, you haven't had a chance to do action about it. And so that's a natural response. But it goes away if you take action. Whether it's a small action or a big action, that's what deals with guilt. And so it's clearly a problem that is a block for a lot of people. And if somehow you can communicate that, you know, we can't do everything, but here's something you can do. And our minister just gave a sermon this morning about he grew up on a cattle farm and tried to give up meat, and he only lasted about a week. And other things, chocolate, sugar, you know, coffee, he was able to do no problem, and actually continued not consuming them afterwards, but meat wasn't able to. And he said, well, you know, you don't necessarily have to go vegan right away. You could say, let's have 1 meal a week where we just don't have any meat, you know. And, you know, I think the same kind of thing. If you feel that you're making progress, that's the answer to guilt. That's what will take away the guilt and make you happier because you're more aligned with your own principles. The problem is that if you're not aware of how what you're doing is not aligned with your principles, then you're never going to do anything about it. And then once you're aware, you just need help to find, what are some ways that I can do that are within my scope and current life situation that can actually make the situation better.
Thank you so much for all of the insight that you've shared with us today, Bruce. I'm going to pass it over to Trudy.
Anyway, on behalf of the 8th Principal Task Force, otherwise fondly known as the Gang of Four, although we welcome more members, I want to thank Bruce for your dedication to the principal and sharing your thoughts with us. And we thank everyone here for coming together for this event and for your thoughtful questions today. And those that we know and we hope will arise as we do this work. And this work just begins when we accept the 8th principle and we adopt it. Then the real work begins. This stage of it is information sharing and question answering, asking, and really digging into our hearts as well as our minds. So we invite everyone to visit uuc.org's 8th Principle page. I've put that link in the chat, probably up near the beginning of it. We hope you participate in future 8th Principle events. We'll have an October 31st worship service. Don't remind me that that's Halloween. We'll work that in. Also, we will hold conversations that we may host, or we'll participate when we're invited by any UUC group, reading group, covenant group, any group who wants to explore the 8th principle further as part of their work. Also, any of us who's, I think Meredith has put our emails in the chat, any of us can be available to talk with you individually and provide more resources, certainly sounding boards and stimulation about activity. Our emails are in the chat. We're also in the UUC member directory. And again, thank you all. And we look forward to seeing everyone on campus in the coming months. As Meredith reminded us this morning, it's important to be together.
Thank you all for inviting me. I really appreciate this chance to talk with you. Thanks.